My name's Caroline, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, and I taught there for a few years before I moved here to where I'm at now in Dubai.
So what do you teach?
I teach here in Dubai. I teach sixth grade English, ELA, and then before in Arizona, I taught eighth grade English, and so I've always been in middle grade, just kind of have run the gamut between like the lower middle grade and then the higher middle grade too, in terms of like grade level.
So you're going on a new adventure next year. Are you staying in those middle grades or are you moving up?
That's one thing that I'm super excited about, and I just found out about it pretty recently, that I'm going to be returning to eighth grade, which it kind of feels like even though I'm moving to a new place, it kind of feels like I'm coming home because the units that they're teaching are similar to the ones that I taught in eighth in Arizona. And like I've already gotten to connect with my teaching partner that I'll have there. And so there's just some really cool like books that we're going to get to read, things that we're going to get to write about, and things that we're going to get to talk about with students that feel kind of reminiscent of what I taught in eighth. And so I'm really excited for that.
And what is your new country that you're going to?
I'm going to the Philippines, Manila specifically.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, great. So we know your occupation is an English teacher.
Yes.
How long have you been teaching English?
I've been teaching English this is my fifth year. So I still feel pretty new at it. A lot of people say that if you like make it through year five, like you're kind of in it. And I feel like especially after this year, I'm like, okay, like I did it. But yeah, this is my fifth year of teaching English. Well, teaching in general, but yeah, teaching English.
Did you go to school specifically to teach English?
So it's actually pretty interesting because I didn't know that I wanted to be a teacher until I was like halfway through my undergrad. And it was kind of one of those overwhelming things where once I knew, I super knew. But my university that I went to didn't offer a secondary education degree for undergrad. They only offered like elementary or primary. So what I ended up doing, which I actually ended up being really grateful for, was that I got my undergrad in English. So I have my bachelor's degree in English with a concentration in American literature. And then I immediately after graduating with my undergrad went and got my master's in teaching and teacher education. So, and then I did my student teaching that at the same time that I was getting my master's. So I kind of got it all out of the way in 1 year, but I really, really loved my undergrad. And that's kind of where my like love of reading, I feel like kind of got reignited. So I felt like that was really important to me being like the teacher that I am now.
Excellent. All right. So we're having this conversation because I feel like your superpower is reading. Can you give us a little insight on how your love for reading even began?
Yeah, it's actually kind of like it began and then it got like separated and then it began again. Is that okay to tell that? Okay. So I, from like a super young age, was a reader. I loved reading. I loved books. I grew up with parents who are readers. And like my earliest memories of reading are like my parents reading to me. And I still remember like those picture books and those stories are really important to me. And I grew up, kind of grew into the chapter books all throughout elementary school. I loved reading. I feel like I like had friends that that's how I made my friends, was based off of like who was reading the same books as I was. And then kind of once I got into, I don't even want to say junior high or middle school, but maybe more high school, when it started to be like I was told what to read by my teachers. That's when I started to sort of fall out of reading. And I just assumed that if I didn't like what I was being told to read, then I just didn't like any books. I just didn't like reading anymore. And then kind of what we talked about earlier, when I got back into my undergrad, I was in some courses where we were given choice in what we got to read. And it wasn't a whole lot of choice. It was even just like, you can choose between these two books. And even that was just like kind of innovative, where I was like, oh, I know that I want to read this one at least more than I want to read this other one. So that kind of like sparked me to pick it up. And I got to read some really fantastic things and learn from some really fantastic teachers in my undergrad. And then it kind of really I personally got back into reading, into that like love and joy of reading, when I started teaching kids and I wanted them to be reading. And I learned really quickly in my first year of teaching was that I couldn't ask my students to do things that I also wasn't doing alongside them. So the thing that I was asking my students to do was to read for 20 minutes every single night. There's just like research behind it that it, improves a bunch of things with your brain. It just makes you a better learner, a better thinker, and I think a better person too. Just reading makes you a better human. And so that's what I was requiring of my students, but then I wasn't doing it myself. And I would get frustrated with my students when I would try to talk to them about what they were reading, and they would say, I'm bad at reading, I hate reading, and I'm not going to read for 20 minutes. And then when I started actually saying like, okay, well, I'm going to do it with you all. Like I'm going to do it too. Because if I can do it, you can do it. We'll do it together. And that's when I started dedicating that 20 minutes every single day. I started, one, reading more. And then when I started reading more, I started actually learning particular things that I liked to read. And I learned what to look for. And I learned what I loved in books. And ever since then, it's been like just a journey, learning more about what I love to read, and just like developing such a big appreciation of like storytelling and books and authors and their stories too.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next question.
Okay.
How do you go about figuring out what types of books you like to read?
It's interesting because I feel like this is something in the past year I've really thought about. And because I spent so much time reading, because I had a lot of time on my hands where I couldn't be, out and doing things. And, reading is something you can do no matter where you are, even if it's like stuck in your apartment. And so I would try to kind of zero in on certain things that if I finished a book and I liked it, this was the year where I really tried to focus in on like what particularly about this particular story did I like. But I feel like it could even go from there. And it's like, if you read a book by an author that you liked, I feel like and this is something that I encourage with my students as well. If you finish a book and you love it and you recognize that you love it, authors tend to write multiple books. Like it's very rare that you like finish a book by an author and they don't have at least one other book out there. So why don't you try their other book? Like there's no rule to reading that says that you have to read a different author every single time, you pick up a book. So trying to find similar things, whether it's like authors or if it's a genre style. So if I were to finish a mystery or like a mystery thriller and I really liked that, there are millions of books in the world that fall under that mystery thriller genre. So let's just try it. And then if I try it and I'm like, oh, I didn't really like that, I'm like, okay, well, maybe it wasn't the mystery thriller genre that I liked. What else could it have been? So that's kind of how I pinpoint those things. And that's kind of what I just said to you is what I recommend to my students as well. Like look at the genres, look at the authors, try to be curious. I tell my students to be curious about your books and about your reading habits, and ask yourself like, well, why did I like that? And what was it in particular? And can I find this anywhere else?
So let's say you started a book.
Okay.
You're not enjoying it.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Do you finish it?
So there's are you familiar with the term DNF?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So DNF stands for does not finish or did not finish. So if you DNF a book, it means you did not finish it. And maybe this is like an unpopular opinion. I personally have probably only ever done that with like one or two books, but I tell my students and everyone else, if you are not liking a book, there are way too many books in the world to read stuff that you don't like. So like if you don't like a book, throw it across the room and like pick up, another one that instantly grabs you. One thing that I do tell my students, because some of them will take that rule and just, read the first page of every single book and be like, I don't like it. I don't like it. So I have I have a rule called either like the 60-page rule or the 30% rule, where before deciding that you don't like a book, try to get to at least the 60-page mark or the 30% mark, depending on how big or small the book is. Because usually, and this is when you're an English teacher, you know how like plot structure works. The beginnings of books are all build up. Now, some authors choose to write their books like that start off with a bang, which is great. But like there tends to be a lot of build up at the beginning of books. So like wait that 60 pages or that 30% for something big to happen. And then you can decide whether or not, you don't like that particular book. And again, if you don't like it, just throw it away. There's way too many good books to be reading.
So I like what you just kind of explained to me, even about if you don't like a book. And you talked us through your process of how you find something that you like. Could you please give us maybe a few suggestions of what you've read recently, like how you found it and the process that you have made with this book?
So not a secret, but when I first started, when I was telling you earlier that I was reading that 20 minutes a night, so that way I could kind of do what my students were doing, I was picking up what I thought my students would want to be reading, which fell into like the middle grade and young adult categories, which like books are typically broken up in age ranges. So you have like adult, then you have young adult, and then you have middle grade, and then children's. So I was reading a lot of middle grade and young adult. And for the longest time, I told myself like, oh, well, I'm just reading it for my students. Like I'm only reading it for my students. When the fact of the matter is like, I love reading middle grade and young adult stories. And both of those age ranges are kind of age ranges in books that have just blown up in terms of like diversity and just different stories and different narratives that are being featured within the past probably 10 years. So like when I was growing up, like when we were growing up, there wasn't nearly the same amount of books in those age ranges. So I know that I like reading middle grade and I know that I like reading young adult. So this book that I recently finished, it's actually the book that I most recently finished, like completed cover to cover. And it's called Everything Sad is Untrue, A True Story by Daniel Nayeri. And the reason that I thought that I would like this, one, it's middle grade. Two, it's a large part of it is based on the author's life experience. And I will always try to pick up authors that are writing from experiences that they know. I feel like it just brings the story to life a lot more. And what I heard about this one, or how I got it pitched to me, is that it is like Persian folk tales and like legends and lore told from an 11-year-old boy's perspective. And this writing was just some of the most beautiful writing that I've ever written. And a lot of people, I feel like when they hear like, oh, it's a middle grade book, it's a book for kids. This is a book that I think should be like required reading for the entire world. One, because of how beautifully the story is told, but also two, just because of what the author had to say and because of like his experiences that he shared were from real life experiences. Now, that being said, the first 50 pages of this, just because of the writing style, because it was so meandering, I had a hard time even getting into it. And I was like, okay, maybe this book isn't for me. Like maybe I need to DNF it. I kept reading it, and now it's probably my favorite book that I've read all year. So it just goes to show that like that 30% or 60-page rule really can pay off in something like this. And then this is a similar one. Well, no, they're not similar at all. But this is, it's called We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal. And this is young adult, and it's a fantasy. So this is where this is like kind of more based on like real life experiences. This is completely like in a ancient Arabia kingdom, like inspired world. I picked this one up off of recommendation from a friend who I have like made through our love of books. Like I have several friends now that I've made like through our love of reading. And she finished this one and she like messaged me and said, Caroline, I know your reading tastes and preferences. Like I know you're going to love this. So that's another thing that I can do with my students. Like when I start recognizing their preferences, I can start recommending like that. And she was absolutely right. I loved this one. So did that answer your question? I don't even, okay. Okay.
So now that you're finished with those books, what happens next?
Like, what do I do with the books or what do I?
Maybe what do you do with the books? Do you give it to somebody else? Do you
okay.
journal about it? And do you already have other books before you finish your next book?
So at the beginning, so here's more like bookish terminology for you. So we have DNF, which stands for do not finish. There's also another acronym called TBR, which stands for to be read. So at the beginning of every month, I'll usually plan out my month of reading and I'll I average around like probably 5 or 6 books a month right now. Now, when I started out like rekindling my love of reading, my goal was 1 book a month. And when I had that goal, I ended up reading 52 books that entire year. But so I do plan out my reading monthly, but I do not like if I feel like let's say this one wasn't on my plan, but I really felt like picking it up, I'll pick it up. Like I don't necessarily have to stick to it. If a book is middle grade or young adult, and I feel like students will like it, it will go into the hands of my students. I do read middle grade and young adult because I love it, but I also read it because I want to be able to recommend books to my students. I'm not precious with my books at all. Like I absolutely believe stories are meant to be shared and like given away. This book, Beartown by Fredrik Backman, was my favorite book that I read last year in the year of 2020. And it is well worn. Like, I don't know if you can tell. This has probably been in the hands since I finished it in March of last year, has been in at least 10 to 12 different people's hands who have read it and enjoyed the story as well. It's been in different countries at this point because it got brought along with someone who was reading it at the time, and then it got passed off in that different country. And it's found its way back to me, but there's definitely been books where I've just been like, if I never see that again, I absolutely will not care because it just means that someone else is enjoying that story as well.
Awesome. So we know that during COVID that you were reading.
Mm-hmm.
What else, not necessarily what else took place, but what did COVID allow you to maybe achieve or accomplish with your reading? So I know that we had a lot of solitude.
Yes.
Big readers is like heaven sometimes.
Yeah.
But during COVID, how did you manage COVID? Or the lockdown specifically?
Yeah. In terms of reading or just like in general?
I mean, maybe both.
Okay. So it's interesting now being kind of semi on the other side of COVID. I mean, I know we're still like very much in it, but just looking back, like kind of at the beginning and how, at the beginning, I feel like I was kind of thinking like, oh, it's going to be like 2 weeks where we all have to stay inside and like not, and I was super excited because I was like, I'm going to be able to get so much read. You know what I mean? And last year, the year of 2020, the year of COVID, I did read the most books that I've ever read in a year before, which was 70. I read 70 books last year. It was also the year that I felt the most kind of disenchanted with reading at certain points. I think that I use reading as like an escape oftentimes, but there were a lot of points in last year where I really needed to be in reality and I needed to feel that reality and not just try and escape. So I kind of would become disenchanted with books as well. And that was kind of an interesting thing to feel because I've always considered myself a reader. And I tell my students this too, that like what makes you a reader is being able to like pick up a book and be happy that you're reading it. That's what makes you a reader. It's not the amount of books you read. It's not like what you're reading or how you talk about the books you read or anything like that. But there were times where I didn't feel like picking up books, and I would like sit and think to myself, like, am I still a reader? Like, do I still like to do this? And I mean, the fact of the matter is, like, absolutely, like, of course you're still a reader. And I tell my students that all the time when they say to me, you know, Miss Bickley, I don't feel like reading, you know, like, or I don't like books, and like, I'm not a reader. And your reading identity is not based on, even if you feel like reading at the time. And so I feel like that's one thing that kind of I learned in the past year, but also there was so many times in the past year where I did need that escape. And that's what stories and authors and books brought to me, was just that like tiniest amount of reprieve, where it's like when you come back up for air and you kind of like look around and like the sun is setting outside and you're like, wow, like I just was completely somewhere else. Even if it was just for 20 minutes, like there was not one thought I had besides what was going on these pages. So yeah.
Thank you so much for all that you've shared already.
Mm-hmm.
But could you give us 3 tips for people who maybe not even desire to read more,
Mm-hmm.
but are interested and want to give it a go
Yes.
to read more?
Yeah, absolutely. My number one tip, I think, is just kind of any habit forming tip. If you want to make anything a habit or anything a practice or do anything more consistently, is have some sort of regimented routine. So you could take the routine that I tell my students, which is just 20 minutes every single day of reading, wherever you can find it. Now, I will tell you that when I started, I mean, 20 minutes, like you hear that now and you're like, oh, 20 minutes, I can do 20 minutes of anything. But like we've all been in those like HIIT cardio classes that they're like, it's just 20 minutes. And you're like, oh yeah. And then like 5 minutes in, you're like, absolutely not. Like, what was I thinking? And sometimes it's kind of like that with reading. Like you set a 20-minute timer and, you know, you're reading for 5 minutes and you look and you're like, it's only been 5 minutes. If that's the case, start with 5 minutes. Like just have your phone, set that timer, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Throw your phone across the room safely so that way you're not like tempted to check it, and then read until the timer goes off. And the moment that you're looking for is when you reach a point in the book where the timer goes off and you think like, I'm going to keep reading. Like, I'm just going to go to the end of this chapter. That's when you know you've found a good book. You're hooked. And that's when I call it the point of no return. Like that's when you hit that point of no return with reading in the book that you're reading. My second tip would definitely be, this is going to sound cheesy, but I do this with my students all the time, is celebrate your reading. If you love a book, celebrate it. If you finish a book, celebrate that. If that's, you know, whether it's posting on social media, like I just finished this book and just posting a picture of it, fantastic. Whether it's like, you know, calling up a friend, calling up a family member, something like that, sharing that you finished a book, if you loved a book, anything like that, like celebrate that. We do not age out of like being proud of accomplishments. And finishing books is absolutely an accomplishment because it means that you like were in another world. It means you gained another perspective. It means that you have a story in your head that wasn't there before. And so that absolutely deserves like celebration. Celebrate, you know, your accomplishments. And then I would say so I said like habit forming, like dedicate time, try to make it like daily or some sort of regimented routine. 2 is celebrate it, because when you feel good about a certain habit, like that's what's going to cause you to do, you know, it again. And then I think that one of my biggest things and what drives me to keep reading is sharing about books. So which kind of goes hand in hand with celebrating it, but you can celebrate reading, you know, solo and on your own. But like I personally have like a social media page that's dedicated to kind of like bookish things, but it doesn't even have to like look like that. Through word of mouth, if you talk about the things that you love, it's going to cause you to want to do those things more. And then when people, if you start sharing that you loved a certain book, someone's going to pick it up. And there is nothing more gratifying, like truly nothing more gratifying than having someone come to you and be like, hey, I picked up that book based on your recommendation and I loved it. And I think that it's just kind of such a unique thing to have that shared experience of loving a book with someone else, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, whether it's a student. Like I know that's how a lot of my really solid relationships with my students are formed, is based off of loving a similar book and talking about it. So routine, sharing your love of reading, and then celebrating your reading as well. My 3 tips.
Okay, to that point, can you tell us where we can find you, where we can see your recommendations and celebrations and you sharing more about what you've been reading?
Yes. So I have an Instagram and it's Miss B Overseas. That's where you can find me on Instagram. I also have a YouTube channel that's kind of up and coming. Well, not up and coming, it's there. You can go find me. I'd love to dedicate more time to that, but that is also Miss B Overseas. And then if you are, this is another tip for sharing your reading, if you're on any sort of like book app, the big one is Goodreads, and you can find me there under Caroline Joy, and you can see what I'm reading, what I rated it, what I thought of all of the books that I'm reading now and that I've read in the past years as well.